5 minutes together. And when Luigi sort of got in touch with me, yeah, the key questions he was interested in exploring were how a Christian parish is in particular of value in our society today. Do they fill a constructive role? Do they help to build and strengthen not only religious communities, but also civic communities? And how can they fulfill their civic role in a pluralistic society? So the discussion I want to open with you all tonight is framed in the light of these questions. You know, what does it mean to talk about the church and specifically the parish in the world? And in other words, what is the church for the community and what is it not? I'm not speaking here as someone who claims to have all the answers or even, you know, a couple of the answers, but I'm speaking as a person who finds this boundary line very interesting, this boundary line between the ecclesiastical and the civic and the church and the world very interesting. So what I want to do is offer you a series of theological resources, basically. Some of these are my sort of greatest hits of favorite theological inspirations to think through with me. What I'll say about my title, first of all, and perhaps, you know, I can put it on the screen for you all, is that there are two images here. So obviously we've got feminist bricks and church walls. So with church walls, what I mean to highlight, you know, I'm told that last month you had this wonderful lecture from Jessica Scott about church buildings. Here, though, I'm thinking about walls as almost a more symbolic motif. And I think it's a great and evocative way about to speak about what characterizes a community, what binds it together, what identifies it, and how is a community sort of, how does it carve out its place in society? So in this talk, I'll be sort of thinking about what kind of walls does the church have? And what kind of walls should it have? And I'm going to take you through 4 different ways in which, that's not exhaustive, but I'm going to highlight 4 different ways in which we can think about this. And the first one is to think about the church as having walls that are both temporal and spiritual, and that's my first topic. The second one is that the church has walls that can keep us safe and can keep people in the community safe. They can provide shelter. The third way I'm going to look at the walls of the church is that's actually potentially quite a damaging thing, which is sometimes historically the church has been a place where we've kept people out with our walls. So I want to think about the church's walls as being exclusionary or exclusive. But finally, I want to think about walls in a way that ground and stabilize a community. So those are the 4 things I'm going to be doing with you today, thinking about church walls in those 4 ways. As for feminist bricks, okay, so this imagery of feminist bricks is not from a theologian, but it's from a feminist theorist called Sara Ahmed. And the context in which Sara Ahmed is writing is that she works for a university, she's a scholar, she's part of the research university. And this is a place for her where women, especially people of colour, especially women of colour, are not flourishing. It's a place where there are walls symbolically and tangibly to keep these people out. And in this context, Ahmed's vital contribution, not just to analysing the nature of the feminist task, but to also supply us with some practical tools for the realisation of this task, includes her referencing policy in the articles that she writes. And in this referencing policy, she says she regards citation itself, so the act of referencing, as feminist memory. So she says citations can be feminist bricks. They are the materials through which and from which we create our dwellings. So those who are left outside of the vast architecture of mainstream theological and philosophical traditions and academic spaces, you know, they find themselves often in this exposed position. So here Ahmed's saying, by citing these people, I'm building a new space. I'm building a kind of more dynamic space, not necessarily bringing them into the same space that already exists, because, you know, that space is clearly problematic, but nevertheless, with my citations, I'm building something new. So that's where this imagery of feminist bricks comes from. So I'm kind of, I suppose what I'm doing there is I'm introducing my position here as a theologian, I guess, as someone who is almost sitting on the walls myself, as a sort of like a bird in terms of my surname as Ravenscroft. I'm sort of like sitting on the wall and thinking, what's going well, what's not going well, what can we do to think through church practice and what it means to be a parish in the community here. So that's sort of my introduction to my title. So together today, I want to run through these 4 motifs I mentioned. And the first one, like I said, is church walls as both spiritual and temporal. So what do I mean by this? Well, I could, by this I could be referring to, what the sort of position we associate with Augustine or Martin Luther, where they had this sort of really developed theory about how the church is in the spiritual, the city of God, and contrast this with the city of man. But I'm actually sort of introducing a much more basic point, a much more rudimentary point with this. And that's just in the sense that I'm thinking of the church-society relationship in this way. And that is that in coming to terms with what it means to be part of a church community and what it means to be part of a parish, we're thinking of ourselves as both rooted in the present, rooted in the world around us, rooted in the material, but also with, the church has as its horizon eternity. The place where our eyes should be are on that transcendent reality that is God. And that's the fundamental anchoring presence that the church has. So at the same time as the church is a worldly place, and this is basically what I'm saying, it's also an unworldly place. It should be an unworldly place with its eyes fixed to the beyond. So what we can say is where a secular society and the broader community within which the church is situated doesn't judge its actions with regard to what is eternal, the church does. And that provides this sort of funny little boundary line where we have to say that the church is at once functioning in time but functioning in eternity as well. Because I find these thinkers quite fun, I just thought I'd reference a couple of thinkers for you to sort of give us something to think about here. So the first thinker I'd like us to have a quick look at is Kierkegaard, Søren Kierkegaard, who's a 19th century theorist, and he says some very polemical things about what I've just noted. So here in his journals and papers, he writes the following. He says, a modern clergyman is an active, adroit, quick person who knows how to introduce a little Christianity very mildly. Sorry, I've clicked through. Very mildly, attractively, and in beautiful language, etc., but as mildly as possible. So he's talking here about a clergyman who's sort of speaking to his parishioners in a way as to make Christianity palatable for them, some way of it can be fitted into their own lives very easily. And he contrasts this, he says, but the New Testament, he said, in the New Testament, Christianity is the deepest wound that can be dealt to a man, designed to collide with everything on the most appalling scale. And now the clergyman is perfectly trained to introduce Christianity in such a way that it means nothing. And when he can do it perfectly, he is a paragon like Minster. And Minster is a theologian in Kierkegaard's day. They don't need to worry about that much. But here, Kierkegaard is saying that he's come across some ministers in his own time who sort of had begun to sort of reduce the church down to a sort of worldly enterprise, to sort of treat it in a palatable way so that, your average congregant doesn't find it particularly unsettling to hear the truths of the gospel, where he says the truths of the gospel are unsettling. He calls them the deepest wound here. So that's an interesting thing about the way in which to be a person of faith, to be a part of a community, has this, for Kierkegaard at least, is walking on this sort of tightrope line between the now and the hereafter. Here's another quote from Kierkegaard. He says, on the other hand, he says this, he says, habitual Christianity can indeed have many forms. And if there were no other choice, if the choice were only between the sort of habitual Christianity, which is a secular-minded thoughtlessness that nonchalantly goes on living in the illusion of being Christian, perhaps without ever having any impression of Christianity, and the kind of habitual Christianity which is found in the sects, the enthusiasts, the super orthodox, the schismatics, if worse comes to worse, he says, I would choose the first. The first kind has still taken Christianity in vain, only in a thoughtless and negative way. But the second kind has taken Christianity in vain, perhaps out of spiritual pride. One could almost be tempted to smile at the first kind because there is hope, whereas the second makes one shudder. So as in the previous quote, obviously Kierkegaard is saying it's an awful thing that we've sort of made Christianity palatable and then made it something that one can sort of be attuned with in one sort of wider light and sort of slot Christianity into this more secular paradigm. Whereas here he says even that has hope. Whereas if you're thinking your Christianity in a prideful way, if it becomes something that you assert in the way that the schismatics do and the the super orthodox and enthusiast, he says that's a worse thing. So this is an interesting thing. I mean, I think for Kierkegaard, you've got to have both. You've got to have a willingness to live in the light of what is eternal, but also a willingness to situate yourself in the broader community of the world, but know that there's a tension between the two. And this is a final quote here that I want to give you just before I move on and say some more about the church's walls in a slightly different way. And this is from a contemporary anthropologist, actually. He's not a theologian, Talal Asad. And I think this is quite a challenging quote for us as sort of Western individuals, because Talal Asad says the following. He says, how does it happen that in modern capitalist society, Christians and non-Christians, believers and non-believers live more or less the same life? Put another way, unless you knew someone well, you could not tell whether she was a believer or not, merely from the way that she lived. What does this say about religious belief? And one answer might be that religious belief, where it exists among moderns, is so deep that it has at best a very tenuous connection with observable behavior. So this is obviously a very generalizing thing to say, and I'm sure we can all think of examples of people where this is not the case, you know, people that live their lives resolutely in a way that sort of makes them stand out from the crowd, as it were. But I think that Assad is getting onto something here, and, you know, the way that it manifests itself in the West, the way that Christians live their lives on a day-to-day basis, you couldn't necessarily tell from the form of them from the outside whether they were Christian or not. This doesn't necessarily mean that that's something wrong going on, but it does make us think about what it means to live as a Christian, and whether that's something different or askance or sort of intention, or should be intention, with the way that one lives one's life as one is in a kind of capitalist Western economy. But yeah, so I thought that was a kind of interesting comment, and this is maybe something we can come back to in the discussion afterwards if you like. But all of these quotes I've been giving you are sort of images of how the church might be or might not be a community that is sort of walking sort of very lightly in the world. You know, it's got this tension, its eyes are fixed towards heaven, but it necessarily still has to dwell in the present. So there's that tension there. So yeah, the church's walls are both spiritual and temporal. So this is the section of the talk that's going to be the longest bit, and I wanted to reflect for a little bit on the role of the church as bringing shelter, food and care. And this is something that I think will resonate with all of you if you're part of, you know, I know if you're part of Father Joya's parish, that churches can open up their doors to local communities in times of need. You know, they still are a symbol of sanctuary and aid now in the 21st century here in England. You know, I often pass the church at the end of my road, and it's often a blood bank. For example, there's churches commonly offer lunches for those who are in need. They are often food banks. We still associate church buildings, I think, with this place of aid. I saw this on Twitter the other day, actually, and I thought I'd show it here. It's this tweet, quite nice. During the storm, this minister had opened his church up into a makeshift refuge centre, because it's in a really rural place, and people said that they were coming in just because they saw the lights were on. So it's amazing to see that, you know, somewhere like this is still regarded as a place that people can go and seek help, and the church buildings do actually matter. What I wanted to talk more about here, though, is this position that churches might have in a community as these sorts of sanctuary places, refuge centres, because I think there's a great deal of scriptural warrant for this. And one of the two New Testament passages I'd like to sort of bring to your attention, our passages you'll all know very well, because they're both so vital and so resonant. And the first one is Matthew 25, 31 to 46, which is Christ's teaching on the sheep, about the sheep, the parable of the sheep and the goats. So this passage, doesn't it, it confronts us with the idea that it's Christ himself who we fail to help if we fail to care for the sick or the thirsty or the outcast or the unwanted. So here we get a real sort of scriptural warrant for why churches need to be these places of refuge and these places of shelter for local communities. So in this passage, which immediately precedes the narrative of Jesus's betrayal and arrest, we have it thrust upon us that Jesus identifies himself with the least or the smallest of people. And in this passage, therefore, we're confronted with the notion that in doing the work of social justice, Christians are not only working in and through Christ, but they're also working for Christ. And it's in such work, moreover, that Christians themselves are worked upon. Something happens to them. They're confronted by Christ in the face of the poor and the needy. And that's what we get in this passage. And I'm going to return to that crucial point later, a little later on in the talk, that Christ identifies himself with the needy in this passage. But for now, I want to move on to this second core New Testament passage that I mentioned. And this is the section in Paul's letter to the Corinthians, where he outlines his vision of the church as a body made up of different members, with each member being honoured or respected according to their particularity, with no one part being dispensable. And this is in 1 Corinthians 12, verses 12 to 21. And here, let's read it out. He says, the eye cannot say to the hand, I have no need of you, nor again the head to the feet, I have no need to you. Of you. On the contrary, the members of the body that seem to be weaker are indispensable, he says. And those members of the body that we think less honourable, we clothe with greater honour, and our less respectable members are treated with greater respect, whereas our more respectable members do not need this. But God has arranged the body, Paul says, giving the greater honour to the inferior member, that there may be no dissension within the body, but the members may have the same care for one another. So if one member suffers, all suffer together with it. And if one member is honoured, all must rejoice together with it. So in St. Paul's words here, those parts of the body which are respectable, or we could even call them beautiful, are not simply beautiful. You know, they're not simply aesthetic accessories. These parts of the body also contribute work. As members of the body, they labour towards the functioning of the whole. And also those parts of the body that we think to be less presentable or proper, those parts that do the dirty work of the body, to put it crudely, actually have their own special kind of beauty, is what Paul's saying here. They are to be clothed with honour. So what do we make here about Paul's language about the body's members? He speaks here in terms of respecting, of valuing, and of honouring different members. Well, for me, this language is significant because if we respect something or if we honour it, we're usually being quite partial. We're treating something in a special way, and we're heeding it in a way that we would not heed something else. So we might say that a lord is given more honour than a knight, and a knight is given more honour than a servant boy, to use medieval language. But by using this partial language, like honouring and respecting, St. Paul is thus indicating that the parts of the body of the church are not to be treated merely in an equal way, so to speak. And I use equal there in the flat mathematical sense of the word, in the sense that 1 is equal with 1, 2 is identical with 2, and so on. Instead, St. Paul seems to be suggesting that as a member of the body of Christ, just as in a person in the world, you know, Luigi here does not equal Ruth as if both of us were numerically or mathematically exactly the same person, nor does Mary equal Martha or indeed Elijah or Isaac. To say that we are equal would be wrong, just as it's just, you know, just as to say that the eye is identical with the ear, is identical with the foot, is identical with the stomach. And that's not just in the sense that we all look different, or we all dress differently, or we all sound differently, or even smell differently, you know, because we can also say that Mary is not treated and should not be treated equally to Martha, because Mary, in Mary's own way of being in the world, has different needs and different desires and different hopes to Martha. So the response of the world to Martha should be qualitatively different to the response that it gives Mary or you or me. And each of us in this Zoom room right at the moment has our own thisness, the own me-ness of me. So that's to say that all of us being, you know, in Paul's language, being parts of the body, need to be honoured in our own way, according to the very specific function that we can provide in this community and that sort of honour that we can bring to it. And the payoff here, I think the payoff here about what I'm saying about this imagery of the body and its different members is a note about how we envisage ourselves as human beings according to like a theological mindset. And what I'd say about this is that differences between human beings, relationships of difference between human beings, the things that make us stand out from one another, these relationships are natural to human life, and they're therefore integral to human flourishing. So the hand is not a foot, it's not a nose, it's not a stomach. And this differentiation is not only clear, but it's also necessary for the well-being of the whole, in the sense that if a body was just a million noses, what sort of body would that be? So what we learn here is that, yeah, difference between people is absolutely vital for flourishing. And I suppose also what the other payoff here, I would say, and this is a big thought, articulated in a very small amount of time, but I'd also say that here we see that there are really stark limitations to what we might call inclusive practices in theological contexts. So when we talk about equality and inclusion, sometimes in doing so we kind of muffle an attention to fruitful accounts of difference between human persons, while we sort of shore up, or we stress instead a kind of notion of a single homogenous ideal of human flourishing. So when we talk about including more people in a system that's already as it is, it doesn't attend properly to this notion that everyone's different. And actually, in order to make the person feel welcome in a system, you have to change the system. You don't have to, you're gonna have to change the way things work. So what I'd say here is that what St. Paul's telling us is there's no final way, there's no one way to be part of a Christian community, and there's no final yardstick against which we are all measured. But there's more. The other thing we learn here is that St. Paul says that every human being is a specific human being, yes, but we also learn from him that there is a unity between us, a community of creatures. We are underpinned, there's something that underpins, underlies, and makes possible all of the differences that we have from one another. And that unity is our being created by God out of nothing. The fact that we are made and we are remade through Christ. So you may remember that as St. Paul introduces this model of the church in 1 Corinthians, he explains the following. He says, "For just as the body is one and has many members, and all the members of the body, though many, are one body, so it is with Christ. For in one spirit we were all baptized into one body, Jews and Greeks, slaves and free, and we were all made to drink of one spirit." So Paul is stressing the unity of people in Christ here, just like he does in Galatians when he says that we're all children of God through faith. But in doing this, importantly, he doesn't undercut or contradict the emphasis he places in his vision of the church on the specific and embodied and fundamentally differing nature of different people in Christ. We are irreducibly different parts within this same body. And what I think he's saying here, this is that although we're all individually different, we are held in being continually by a God who is beyond all difference. So in God, who is transcendent and perfect, there are no attributes that will make God different in the human sense. You know, God is beyond height or gender or fitness or, you know, having arms and legs and a body. Transcendent, perfect God is thus in a position to hold in being, without partiality or pain, without trouble or qualm, all humans in all of their differences. And he can love all humans for their differences. So we can see here that people, as bodies, our material nature matters, and we're shaped by our bodies, and we live in them, we live through them, and the good that we do in the world is good that we do through them. And so to be healthy is to look after these bodies, and the needs that we have are consistent with the nature of these bodies. But in addition to this, however, I think what St. Paul also wants to communicate here is what the Israelites were made to learn in the desert, and what Christ himself practiced in his own journey into the desert, namely that the truth that one does not live by bread alone, but by every word that comes from the mouth of the Lord. So here's a move back again to that notion that in the church, we are both addressed as temporal people, but also spiritual people. We live with our eyes sort of fixed towards heaven. Because as dressing us as temporal people, scripture nevertheless tells us that we have a purpose and a set of needs that cannot be seen fully by human eyes, or fully tasted by human lips, nor fully taken away by the hands of other humans. As God's creatures, in other words, it's been given to us to be more than just our statuses on earth. And the good news of Jesus Christ amounts to something other to, and something much more significant than, simply earthly riches or power. And this is why St. Paul can include those who are slaves even in the body of Christ, in the body of the church, because we are more than our worldly needs. We're more than our bodies, and we stand in the present with our eyes looking and seeing in the light of the eternal. So those are some kind of scriptural warrants for why the church needs to be a place of sanctuary for people, because it's a place where we can understand this theologically fundamental point that we are worthy of being honoured in our bodies, but that we are nevertheless at the same time much more than our bodies, and those two things are constantly held in tension. I want to move now to talk about the third way in which we can be said to think about church walls. And this is as church walls, unfortunately, as being sometimes very exclusive and very excluding. And in fact, at this point, you might turn around to me and you might say, look, Ruth, everything you've been saying about St. Paul's vision of the church, everything he tells us about the worth of people, doesn't it seem like a bit of a slap in the face to those who are out there, who find the walls of the church very high and find them very insurmountable? One might say to me, has not the church in the past and in the present been an institution which just excludes some of those who are marginalized in society? And you might even say, isn't not even a very difficult place to be in sometimes for those people? Is it sometimes a difficult place for people to work well within? Well, I do think that St. Paul's vision of community is actually really important here, because St. Paul's notes about the church's body and the worth of that body, with all of its integral differences, can help Christians to articulate the absolutely fundamental sense in which anything less than upholding honour and respect for its members is an absolute scandal. And I was said before that I'm going to take you through some theological resources I find really helpful in this talk, and obviously scripture is one of them. But at this point, I'd just like to kind of direct you to liberation theology as a really rich theological resource on this point. Liberation theology is a 20th century theological movement arising in Latin America with theologians like Gustavo Gutierrez, but being continued in the work of people like Rosewood Ruther, who's a feminist liberation theologian, and the Black liberation theologian James Cone. And in this school of thought, in this theological tradition, God is a liberator of the oppressed. So liberation theologians think and believe that God speaks particularly to the poor, and they use a number of the scriptural warrants that I've been talking about to argue this. So in someone like Gutierrez, who's writing in Latin America, in his theology of liberation, you get a critique of a critique of theological approaches to salvation that just focus on the spiritual. They just focus on that which humans can hope to receive after death and resurrection. Because for Gutierrez, yes, Christ is the only one who can save and the only one who can liberate from sin and admit humans to communion with God. But in the full sense, Gutierrez argues, salvation for humans has to begin now. In the present, we are called to fight injustice, and we're called to see humans as they are and include humans properly in our communities. So in liberation theology, you get this expanded attention to what is actually originally a Marxist conception of alienation, and a recognition that in society, humans are often alienated from aspects of our own human nature. And so in liberation thought, it's not only the job of the church to preach the gospel as something, that's going to apply to our lives in the hereafter, but they say it's got to apply now. And salvation for them is a struggle against an unjust society and the creation of a new humanity in the light of the word. So to work towards the transformation of the world is to be part of the saving action for someone like Gutierrez. So earlier on, I mentioned I was going to return to the teaching conveyed in Matthew 25 that Christ identifies himself with the poor. So here I want to make that return, because part of what is articulated in the response to the dehumanization and the alienation of the world that liberation theology addresses is part of what happens is we need to turn and we need to point to Christ, because Christ is the one who speaks before and on behalf of all Christians in this moment. For having identified himself with the vulnerable and the outcast in his teaching about the sheep and the goats, Christ, of course, was betrayed and he was arrested. And as part of this betrayal, he himself was treated simply as a lump of flesh, as a thing to be disposed of. His body was stripped, he was flogged, and he was afforded no dignity whatsoever. And then he was transferred to a cross where his life was bled out of him. And so Christ is not only symbolically identifying himself with the poor and the suffering in his teaching about the sheep and the goats, he then goes on to become one of them, someone who is absolutely alienated from his humanity on the cross. And it's in view of this that James Cone, who's a Black theologian of liberation, writes, yes, he says that life is not possible without an opening towards the transcendent. But the gospel cannot just be a transcendent reality, it must also be an immanent one. And he uses, James Cone does, in this really powerful book he's got called The Cross and the Lynching Tree. He uses the image of the lynching tree, which is obviously incredibly resonant and horrendous in the Afro-American community that he is part of. And he says, you have to hold the lynching tree in combination with the cross if you're thinking about liberation for African-American people. And he says the lynching tree frees the cross from false piety. In the light of the lynching tree, the cross is no longer able to be perceived as a symbol of abstract sentimental piety. And that's that identification going on between Christ and those who suffer. But he says, on the other hand, the lynching tree nevertheless needs the cross, or else it is merely an abomination. So we come back again at the end of this third meditation on what kind of walls the church has, to this point about the church being in the present, but also with its eyes towards the eternal, living in light of the eternal. And I've got, with the sort of 5 minutes I've got left, I want to now turn us around to thinking about church walls as providing roots and foundation for the local community. And this final category, I want to speak briefly about Simone Weil. And Simone Weil, so in 1943, having recently arrived in England, the theorist and activist Simone Weil was approached by the Free French in London to author a report on the task of organising the regeneration of France. And this is, in this very difficult time, 1943. And the resulting document that she wrote as a philosopher became her posthumously published work, which is The Need for Roots. And I'd really recommend this to anyone, this book, The Need for Roots. And she made the following pronouncement in this book, and I'm going to put it up on the screen now. She says, to be rooted is perhaps the most important and least recognized need of the human soul. It is one, it is one of the hardest to define. Let me just find the, there we go. To be rooted is perhaps the most important and least recognized need of the human soul. It is one of the hardest to define. And she says, a human being has roots by virtue of his real, active and natural participation in the life of a community, which preserves in living shape certain particular treasures of the past and certain particular expectations for the future. So it's speaking in the context of war and occupation. I think it's significant that Weil turns first not to the assertive language of rights and freedoms to discuss programmatically what it means to live together fruitfully as human beings, but to this involved language of duty and obligation. And she even talks about obedience at this point. And paramount here in Weil's account of the human soul's essential needs, which include honor, order, responsibility, and perhaps more unexpectedly, obedience and punishment. Paramount in this account of the soul's essential needs, she says, is the need to actively and naturally participate in the life of a community. And this is her whole argument in this book. And I think this is really important for thinking on the parish, basically. Her whole argument is humans need to be rooted. And the reason I mention this here really is that Weil helps us to consider why providing any sort of meaningful home for a person requires much more than the simple allocation of space and shelter. So we talked about shelter earlier, but she challenges to consider how fundamentally important it is for human well-being that people are able to cultivate bonds. They're able to cultivate shared memories and institutions with one another over time. So the roots that Weil talks about in this book are completely multiple. We're not just musing about knitting a person into a particular region, nation, or institution, or about ensuring that that person is fed, clothed, and secure in their employment. And those are all really important things. She's also talking about making a person accountable for their past, the past of their ancestors, as well as responsible for the future of their community as well. So as I said, it's to make a really utterly banal and basic point, to say that human life is shaped and limited by the fact that we have bodies. And I talked about that a minute ago when I was talking about St. Paul's account of the church. We're made of flesh and blood. We have all the accompanying biological requirements and urges. But emboldened by reading Vey's book, I would add that humans can become very good at denying the intergenerational responsibility that's entailed in having a body and living in our world. So as individuals, we're on Earth for only a relatively short time. But despite our precariousness, despite our fleetingness, we can be good at ignoring both our inheritances and our legacies. We can fail to cultivate practices of remembrance for those who have gone before, and we can fail to cultivate hope and expectation for those who will come afterwards. So Simone Weil protests that when human souls are shorn of the perception of obligations to past, present, and future human communities, as well as from the opportunity to fulfill these obligations, they become sick and inert because they're uprooted. And I think the parish in particular, just to bring things home now to Luigi's set of questions behind this series of talks, I think that the parish should be a place that can provide us with walls that maintain such communal and networked rootedness. So, standing very firmly in time amid the machinations of history, between generations, while also living in the light of the gospel, the parish is, or it should be, a place where Christians can hopefully gather the perspective to cultivate practices of memory and memorialization for those who have gone before, but also live in a way that prepares the way for those who will follow. And I think it's no surprise that a central category in Simone Weil's philosophy became that of attention. The practice of developing a loving and patient regard, almost the practice of standing still, taking account of what is true and what is real, taking account of the needs that others have. So that was my final reflection really on what kind of walls the church should or indeed does have. Walls as community foundation, and this sort of more organic metaphor that bursts in here, which is roots. So yeah, the 4 ways I've said that the church can or does have walls is that firstly, it has walls that are both temporal and eternal. It has walls that are able to provide shelter, able to provide refuge to those in need. It has walls that have sometimes and often been, unfortunately, excluding and exclusive, but there are very key resources within the church to challenge this sort of way of thinking. And finally, church walls should be, I think, what can root us in our communities.